Hello, you should be able to hear me now. Just to make sure you can, could you just write in the group chat? I think there should be a little box towards the bottom right of your screen. So if you could just say, yes, I can hear you, or something like that, that would be really great. Brilliant, thank you, Katie. Excellent, that's brilliant. Okay, so some people might join shortly, but I thought we'd kick it off now. I understand that a lot of you have got very busy lives, so we'll try and get through this as quick as we can. So I'd just like to firstly welcome you to the training event and thank you actually for deciding to become involved in the project as a whole. You're all here, I hope, because you're interested in organising and running a Lest We Forget collection day of some kind, or getting involved in the project in another way. So my aim today really is to give you all of the knowledge and all of the tools that you will need to organise and run your own Lest We Forget digital collection day. Now to do that, we're going to divide the session up into, I suppose, 4 areas. And here we go. So we'll start by looking at what a collection day is, what a digital collection day is. Then we'll move on to looking at what the 4 stages of a collection day are. Then I'm going to give you some tips as to how you can make that collection day a success, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Now, I should say at this point that if you have any questions at all as I'm talking, if you could just type it into the group chat, and at certain points I can just stop and go through some of your questions and answers. I suppose that would be better than waiting right until the end for you to raise your question. Now, before I begin the main bulk of the session, I should really introduce myself. My name is Matthew Kidd. I'm involved in the Lest We Forget project. I've been working on it for several months now, and I'm very passionate about the study of the First World War in general. So there's a strong reason why I'm involved in this project. And another thing that I should mention just before we start is that all of the forms and all of the posters and the various materials that I'm going to talk about have been emailed to you, I hope. Anyway, it should have been attached to the email I sent to you. If it hasn't, I will be sending you all an email after, again with the attachments. So if I talk about something like an object list and you're not really sure what that means, then if you look through the online training pack and the digital version of the pack, you'll be able to find that. So we'll begin then by giving a little bit of a background about the project and about what a digital collection day is. Above all, it's an Oxford University-led project that works in collaboration with the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation. I'm sure many of you have heard of this organisation. Essentially, it maintains the graves, the cemeteries, the buildings, and the memorials for armed forces killed during the war. Now, originally, this project was a crowd-funded project, but the current incarnation of the project has really been allowed to prosper, I suppose, thanks to some funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund that we got last year. Now, the main aim of our project is to capture all the stories, objects, artefacts, and memories of the First World War before they're lost to history. Once we've captured all of those artifacts, we want to store them. We want to store them into a digital archive for use of future generations. And those generations, that could include researchers, educators, teachers, students, anybody really that has an interest in the history of the war. At the end of our project, which will end in about June or July, we want to move all of the stories and all of the items that we've collected into an online European-wide archive called Europeana Collection. And that currently has about 300,000 images of various historical events and developments, including the First World War. There are some other reasons why we're involved in this project, though. We want to help people and communities to learn about the First World War. We want to give them a slightly more complete picture of the war. So obviously we get a lot of military-based items, things like medals and even weapons, but we also collect a lot of non-military related items, things like diaries, souvenirs, letters, journals, postcards. And we're hoping by collecting all those kind of artifacts as well, we can show that the war wasn't just fought on the Western Front, but also there was a lot of important developments going on in the UK as well. And like today, we also think it's useful to be able to train people. Let me just check that. Okay, sorry about that. There we go. So to teach people how to run collection events as a whole. So maybe once in the future you decide to do something else, perhaps around the Second World War or another kind of historical event, you'll have all the tools and the knowledge required to be able to do that. Now, I'm sure you'll all agree there are several reasons why this is important, why it's important right now, especially when the First World War, in some respects, is being forgotten. We're now 100 years on from the First World War. The stories of those who fought and died in the war have passed from living memory now. And actually, a lot of their sacrifices are only half remembered from tales that were handed down, often through 4 or 5 generations. So this is really our last opportunity, I'd argue, to galvanise people to find those artefacts, to learn and share their stories before they're lost forever. We've also found that a lot of these items are not recorded. A lot of people have First World War related items, but they're often small, personal, dispersed. They're kept in attics, cupboards, drawers, and that means that they're at risk of being lost. When a family member dies, perhaps, or when there's a house move, these things really have a risk of going missing. There's also, and this is something I've found, a general lack of connection to the First World War, especially when we compare it to the connection we have to the Second World War. I'm speaking as someone who's in their early 30s, and I know everything about my grandparents who were in the Second World War. I know very little about that next generation, and I think that's quite common, especially today. So in some ways, our project is trying to help establish or re-establish those connections. So how do we actually do this then? Well, we organise what we call digital collection days, and there's a couple of pictures here that I hope you can see, and they're both examples of what a digital collection day is. So we go into far more detail a bit later on about what this is. But I'm just going to give you a very brief summary now of what we mean. Now, usually a digital collection day is a one-day event where members of the public can bring along their First World War related stories or objects to be digitised and uploaded to our online archive. Now, the aim is to collect all of that material from the public, to digitise it, which I'll go into a bit more detail shortly about, and then upload it. Now, this is a very simple process. Now, even though we facilitate this kind of thing and we deliver training and we have been involved quite heavily in these events in the past, we actually encourage volunteers to organise them themselves, and that's what today's training is all about. So as you can see here, we have 2 very different kinds of collection days. On the left, we have one that was run, I believe, in a village community centre, and it's slightly more relaxed, I suppose. On the right, we have one that was run in a school in Oxford, and actually the children you can see there, some of them were involved in helping to run the event. So obviously they weren't completely responsible for everything that happened, but they did get involved quite heavily. So in some ways, it feels like an Antiques Roadshow event you'll come to see, without the valuing. We don't obviously value all of the different items. So how do we actually organise these days then? Well, there's a 4-stage process which we really do encourage you to stick to. And again, I suppose we encourage you to be as creative as you can with these things, but this is the 4-stage process that we advise you to follow. So at the beginning, we have what we call a welcome stage. And again, I'm going to go into more detail shortly about this. But this is where we welcome visitors, we introduce them to the event, we introduce them to the project as a whole. We give them certain forms that they need to fill in, that gives us permission to use the items and the stories they give us in a variety of formats. We then move on to the interview stage. Now, interview sounds very formal, and we don't really mean that it's a very heavy interrogation, but this is the stage effectively where volunteers talk to the visitors about their items and about their stories, and then record that information, jot it down, and jot down as much as they can about this story. We then move to the digitisation stage, and this is where those stories and objects are digitised. And what we really mean by that is they're scanned or they're photographed or they're digitally recorded in some way so that they can be stored on computers. And then we go to the upload stage. This is where we upload all of those stories, all of those scans and photographs onto our online archive. Now, this upload stage usually happens after the digital collection day. By the end of doing the other 3 processes, you're usually very tired and you want to have a bit of a rest. So we advise you to do the upload stage maybe a few days or a week or so after the event. So as you can see, this 4-stage process is very simple. But how does it actually work in practice? Well, this is a visual representation of what a collection day might look like. You don't have to organise your event exactly like this. You don't have to have green chairs and things like that. But this just hopefully gives you some idea of how a room might be organised. So you can see here at the bottom, these are doors. A visitor comes in, they are greeted by a welcome desk. At the welcome desk, they have to fill in certain forms. They're welcomed by volunteers. They're told what the day will entail and various other information. And then they're walked over to that interview area in the top left. This is where all of the information they have about a story or an item is handed over to interviewers, I suppose you could call them, who jot all that down and collect the items. Then their items and stories are walked over to the digitisation area, as you can see here, on the far right. This is where they're scanned and photographed and recorded in some fashion. And then we've put upload here, but as I said, the upload stage can actually take place after the event, and it usually does. Now, this 4-stage process, as you can probably gather, can actually be applied to various kinds of settings. So here's some images, I suppose, of 4 different examples. So in the top left, we have a church hall, which is a nice rectangular shaped building where you can organise the collection day however you want. Then to the right, this is actually in a school library, and you can see here with the amount of books, it wasn't quite as open, but we made it work. So it shows you don't have to have a nice big hall or anything like that. You can pretty much do it anywhere. The bottom right you can see is another school hall, but with climbing frame equipment, but it's all pushed back. And then the bottom left, I think that was a museum of some kind. But more recently, we've done one in Plymouth, which was actually in a big welcome reception area of a university where there were lots of people walking around. And we just managed to fit it in there. And in some respects, that was nice because you had people that weren't intending to come along actually getting involved. So this is the point of this slide, really, is to show you that however you intend to run it in whatever setting, there is a way you can do it. Now, remember, if you do have any questions, feel free just to pop them in the group chat at the bottom right. If anything pops in your head, jot it down and I'll come to it and give you an answer at a certain point. Something also to remember before I start drilling down into more details about the 4 stages, you need to remember that it doesn't have to just be a digital collection day. Now, often many of the events we do run are just collection days and they're advertised as such. But we found that you're actually more likely to attract visitors if there is more going on. Now you can see down the bottom left in the photo there, we've had the media come along, and actually people like the idea that they might get on the local radio or get a quote in the local press. So that's always something you can promote. The middle image at the bottom, you can see there's an exhibition of some kind. So if this is in a library, they might have a records office that's linked to the library, where they might actually have some other archival material from the First World War. So it might be a good idea to link your collection day in with an exhibition of some kind. And then the bottom right image is from Cheney School in Oxford, where we brought some living history actors along who have a large collection of replica materials, and the kids were very interested in being able to wear the hats and put on gas masks and hold the weapons and things like that. So if you're trying to target that kind of audience, perhaps parents who will bring along kids, then it's always good to have something like that going on. And also, if you are hoping to attract a more diverse range of people, different ages, for example, having some learning activities is always good. And we've recently had someone organise one where they just printed out things like colouring in papers with pictures of the First World War, where people could just sit and colour them in. So that might sound quite irrelevant, but if you've got parents bringing along children, it just keeps their interest. So if you don't have any questions, then I think I'll just move on. We will move on to start looking again at the 4 stages, and I'm going to go into more detail now about what those 4 stages involve. So welcome, interview, digitisation, upload. They're the 4 main areas to remember. So this is the welcome stage then, and these images are from previous collection days where, as you can see, there's a diverse range of people, and it might be in different settings, but fundamentally the welcome process is the same in all cases. The welcome desk is the first thing that visitors will see when they arrive at the event. It's where visitors are made to feel welcome. It's where they're told about the aims of the project. It's also where they're given details about the collection day and what they can expect. And as you can see in the image on the right, there's some paperwork that they're going to need to fill in. Now, the first bit of paperwork that we have on this desk is entirely for the benefit of the organisers and for the volunteers that are sat at the desk. And this is what we call a welcome desk tracking form. Now, as I said, this will be in the training pack that I sent to you, and it's also in the pack that I'm going to send to you after. So don't worry if you've lost or you accidentally deleted that email that I sent. Now, as you can probably see from this, the tracking form is very simple, and it's just a really simple way of you keeping track of who comes along to your collection day and in what order they do that. So you can see there's a numerical system here, and you can just jot down the name of the person, perhaps a mobile contact number, and there's also a column to say whether they've been interviewed yet. And this is just a nice way of keeping track of who has come in. Now, obviously, if it's not particularly busy, it's not that vital, but we found that a lot of people tend to come to the event. If you've advertised it for a 2 o'clock start, the majority of people tend to come for 2 o'clock. So actually getting them in some sort of order, jotting down their details is really important at that first stage. The other form that we have on the welcome desk, and there's no way you're going to be able to read this one on the slide, but you will be able to read it in your handbook, is what we call the permissions form. Now, all contributors that come along and want to share their story and to share their item are going to have to fill this in. It's really important that they do that. So you'll see there's quite a lot of information on there, and we would recommend you familiarising yourself with the form before you organise the event. Now, broadly speaking, by signing this form, contributors are agreeing that that we, as volunteers and as representatives of the project, have a right to share the material that they've brought in. And it also confirms that they're happy for others to see and to reuse the digital versions of those items online. So you can imagine this is a very important document, and if they don't fill it in, we can't upload and we can't share the stories and the items that they brought along. And there are some other tick boxes at the bottom of the form you can probably make out. It just says whether they want to remain anonymous. So if somebody contacts us later on after the event and says, oh, that item is really interesting, can you put me in contact with the original owner? Then that box says, yes, we can. Or actually, if people want to remain anonymous, we can't pass those details on. So as I said, if you do familiarise yourself with that before the event, that would really be good. Can I just check that you can still hear me? I've been speaking for 20 minutes and there's been no response. I just want to make sure that everyone can still hear me. So if you can just write in the group chat that everything is going okay, that's good. It's very strange just talking to a computer with no response. Brilliant, thank you. Now the welcome desk serves another purpose. It's actually a place where visitors can read the project's data protection poster. And here we are. And again, you might not be able to read everything on here, and you don't have to at this stage. This data protection poster almost puts in a more convenient and more user-friendly format the information that's on that permission form. It explains what's going to happen to the stories and the objects that contributors share with us. It tells them what information we're going to hold, what we're going to share, and what we won't share. It also tells them about where the information is going to be stored. And they're stored on the Oxford University servers. And it's just things like that. If people are quite concerned about copyright and various things like that, we tend to encourage them to have a look at this form, which we don't make them sign, but we do tend to put them around the venue, maybe have a batch of them on the welcome desk. And some people have actually blue tacked them up on the walls or on the doors as people come in. So we advise you to make this visible at your venue, although they don't have to sign it. And again, all of this can be found on the website or in the training pack. So if you are organising this event, it will probably be your responsibility to decide which volunteers go on which station. And if you're trying to think of who could we put on a welcome desk, then you need to think about the following. You'll need to make sure that the people that are going on the welcome desk are good meet and greeters, people that actually enjoy conversing with members of the public. They're actually really helpful and comfortable helping people. They enjoy face-to-face contact. They're good at answering questions, resolving queries. And also people that can show a bit of initiative. If, for example, they can see that the interview station, the next station, is very busy, they might try and almost encourage people to come back later, perhaps. So we need someone that actually can show initiative, can observe and identify if there are bottlenecks at the later stages, maybe advise people to go and have a cup of tea, that kind of thing. And again, these things will only really matter if it gets very busy. Usually there's a steady stream of people and it doesn't get too busy. Something else to think about, if it does get busy, is perhaps to have a public area near your welcome stage. And here's some ideas of what I mean. Now, once you've taken the visitor's details, once you've jotted that down, once you've made sure they've completed that permissions form, they need to go to the interview stage. But if every desk at the interview stage is full and there's too many people being interviewed already, they're going to have to wait. Now, obviously, you don't just want them standing at the welcome desk, twiddling their thumbs. So what we do is we encourage you to have a public area of some kind, and it doesn't have to be as extravagant as some of these examples. It could just be a refreshments area. Everyone likes free tea and free coffee and free biscuits and things like that. So it might just be something like that. If you are slightly more creative, I suppose, you could replicate some of these ideas that you can see on the screen. The top left is at a school, and this is a living history organisation that the people there pretend that they're from the First World War. They know everything about the war and the trenches. They bring along all these materials, and they often give talks. And this is actually quite a good way of keeping people's interest up, because they can ask them anything about the First War, and these people should know. Now, obviously, that has a cost implication, but it's something, especially if you're trying to attract young people, if you're working at a school, is a good way of keeping people's interests. And there are some various other ideas here. At the bottom left, you can just see, for example, putting up images, putting up videos on a projector is always a good way of keeping people interested. Now, the next stage is the interview stage. And there are two essential tasks for volunteers at this stage to complete. Now, above all, the interview areas where volunteers are going to talk to the visitors about their story, about their objects, and they're going to record all of that information on a couple of forms that I'm going to talk about. Now, as you can see from these images, we do advise you to have two volunteers on each desk. This is because if you're having a conversation with someone that's brought along some items, you've also got to jot down everything they're saying. Now, that's quite difficult. If you're having a conversation, especially if you're very interested in that conversation, you might forget to write all the information down. So we advise having someone that talks to the person and sort of interrogates them, I suppose, for want of a better word, and the other person is there to jot it all down. Now, as I said, there are two essential tasks at this stage. The first is to complete what we call a story form. Now, you might be able to make out the words on here, but basically what this form does, it gives you space to complete all of the information and complete everything that you'll need to be able to upload it onto our site later on. So the first stage of the form, it says story, and this is where you jot down everything that the person says, and it could be anything, the name of the person, where that person fought, anything you want can just go in there. Then we have smaller boxes, which is if you want to be slightly more detailed, you can fill those in as well. And as I said, name of the person you could put there, their connection to you. So that could be, for example, if it's the original person's great-grandson, for example, it would be good to write that down there. There's a box for dates. So if somebody's talking about someone perhaps died during a certain battle, it'd be great if you could put the dates there. We're not expecting you all to be experts on the First World War and know the date of every battle. But if you're not sure, you can just put 1914 to 18, for example. It's not that important. The most important part of this form is that top section, that you get as much information as you can. And then we have some other boxes, places related to events or people. If they talk about the person maybe born in Southampton, or they fought in a certain battle, or they were on the Western Front, just jot that information down there. And then in the next box where it says objects in relation to story person, you just write down some very basic information about the items they brought along. You don't have to list the name of every medal. You can just say medals, for example. And you'll see why on the next slide. And then right at the bottom, you can see there's a question that says, did this person survive the war? Yes, no, or not sure. And right at the bottom, you can see it says additional pages used. And it might just be worth having a wad of extra story forms, or just some blank pieces of paper, because sometimes people come along and they have a very long story to tell. So this story box isn't necessarily the perfect size for that. Just before I move on, I'll just give you a couple of tips for this stage. You need to remember here that the interview might actually be your only opportunity to collect information about the story and the object. So you need to try and extract as much information as you can from the visitor. Now, often people will come along with a prepared statement. So they know everything about the medal. They know everything about their great-grandfather. So they'll come along with a prepared statement that they're going to give you. And that's great, and you want to jot down as much as you can about that. But there might be some other information that you can maybe get out of them. We've often found, for example, people come along with this prepared statement, but then they say, for example, oh, my brother has a different version of this story, or my great-grandfather told somebody else a different story. Now, often people that come along don't pay much attention to that. They don't think it matters, but actually to us, and if you're thinking of historians that are interested in this idea that there are different versions of events and things like that, that is really interesting. So don't be afraid to almost try and unpick that thread and say, okay, that's interesting. Why do you think your brother has a different version of events? Why is there a discrepancy here? That kind of thing. Also remember, though, when you are unpicking those threads, that the visitors come along and they're actually sharing something that can often be very personal and important to them, and maybe emotional. So you do have to be sensitive. So don't treat it so much like an interrogation. Be mindful of the story, but also be mindful of the objects. These are very old objects, so don't just go and pick them up. We advise you to ask people if you do want to pick them up and have a look and turn them over. Maybe ask the contributor first if you're allowed to do that, or if you just want to play it safe, you can ask them to pick it up. If you want to look at the underside of an object, maybe ask the contributor to do that for you. Before I move on and give you some suggested questions, I'll just try and answer your questions. So we have one from Brian. Photographic release GDPR form on photos taken on the day. I assume, Brian, you're saying, is there any more detailed information about GDPR that you can take on the day? I wasn't really sure. Yes, and Brian, he's just said, white gloves from boots for handling is a very good idea. So if we try and advise you not to handle the items, if you do have to handle the items, and you will at the photograph stage, either clean your hands and make sure they're very clean, or if you want to use white gloves, then go for it. So sorry, Brian, I wasn't really sure about what you meant about GDPR. So if you want to go again on that one, you can. Callum Dixon says, what is the protocol if someone manages to bring in an actual weapon such as a bayonet? We've had that in the past, actually, and sometimes when people have made posters for these events, they have actually said, please don't bring weapons, because it's legally, you're not allowed to carry something like a bayonet or a knife around with them, or even a live ammunition or something like that. So we advise people not to, but if they do, we tell them immediately, look, I'm sorry, we can't actually take this item. We tell them to leave. And again, you have to be quite sensitive about that. You don't just want to tell them to leave. But unfortunately, it's illegal for them to be carrying these things around. And if you are really keen to get these items digitized, it could be that you just arrange another time, perhaps, or in a slightly different setting where they maybe have confirmed that it's all been registered, that it's all been legally sorted out. But we have had to tell people in the past that they can't carry an open knife around. So the safest thing for you to do from an insurance and a legal perspective is to ask them to kindly leave, I'm afraid. So Brian's come back. If pictures taken on the day get released from person before publishing, or put up signs saying pictures being taken, if they object, yeah, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Sorry. Yeah. And people are going to be in photographs that you're then going to share. Yeah, we absolutely advise you. If you want to start taking pictures of perhaps the queue of the people that are coming in, you will need to get permission. Not everyone's happy with that, especially if you then want to share those images. All the image, I would say, just to cover my own back, all of the images that you see on these slides were agreed, even the ones with children in. So yeah, we are really mindful of that. And it's something that you would need to think about if you did want to walk around with a camera taking pictures of the day, making sure you get permission beforehand. So thinking about the interview, it's a very simple system really of who, when, what and where. Don't apologize, Brian, that's a really good point. If you have any more excellent points like that, just raise them and I can share them. So yeah, who, when, what or where. So when you're thinking about who the story is about, some possible questions could be, what is your relationship to this person? Often the person that is bringing an item along has a familial connection with that person. It could be the great-grandson, the great-granddaughter. Sometimes people have just bought some medals off of eBay, so they have absolutely no connection whatsoever. But that in itself is interesting to us, and we want to get as much information about that as we can. So we often ask people, do they know anything about what happened to the person who owned the objects during the war, but also after? If they survived, what did they go on to do? Now, a really important question, and this is something that you'll find, is did the person ever talk about the war? You'll realize and you'll come to find that actually a lot of people had all these objects, but they never really shared much information about them or how they obtained them. When we move on to the when questions, we ask them, when did the events take place? Did the person join before the war? Did they join the army, before the war? Were they conscripted? Did they volunteer? When were they demobilized? When were they born? When did they die? When was the photograph taken? When was the postcard sent? That kind of thing. And also, what happened? What is the object? What do you know about the object? How did they get it? And actually, a lot of the items people bring along were recovered from the battlefield. So we've had people bring along debris and things like that was just recovered from the battlefield. And it'd be great if you can find out which battlefield it was recovered from. Who had it before them? Where do you keep it? It's quite an interesting question to ask. Where do people keep these things? Often they're locked away in a cupboard, but sometimes people have put them in nice frames and they have it as pride of place in their front room. And then finally, where did this take place? Where is the object from? Where was the person born? Where did they serve? These are the kind of questions, but you'll find that this is quite a natural thing. We say it's an interview, but it's always quite conversational. So what we do here also, and this is where it might slightly get tricky, but it shouldn't be if you take your time with this section. So we've written the story, we've got a story form, we filled it out, and now we need to think about a way in which we can organize the materials and the items they've brought. Now, often people will bring more than one item. Sometimes people will bring lots of items, and it's really important that we categorize them in some form, and you'll realize why when we look at the upload section and the digitisation section. Now, the way in which we've worked out to do this is by using raffle tickets. This makes it much easier for us to keep track of the object and to also associate that object with a particular story. And as I said, this is going to be really important when you come to digitizing and uploading the stories at a later time. It's also important when a visitor comes to collect their objects after they've been digitized. So if you think of cloakrooms at things like museums or music events, where you hand your coat in and you get a raffle ticket. At the end of the event, you go along, you give them your raffle ticket and you get your coat back. We use the same kind of system for their First World War objects, but obviously these objects are more valuable than a coat. So you have to be really vigilant on this, but we do find the raffle ticket system works quite well. So when we're interviewing the visitor at that interview stage, one of the volunteers will give each object or each group of similar objects one raffle ticket. We will keep one half of that raffle ticket with the object and with the group of objects, and we give the other half to the visitor. And we record all this information in an object list, which I'm going to show you in a minute. But I'm just going to give you an example here. So you can see the image. You've got a selection of items, and we've got a book of raffle tickets. Now, in this example, what we could do is to say, right, there are 3 buttons here. We don't have to give each button an individual raffle ticket. We could group those 3 buttons together and say, that is number 351. We have 1 medal there. We could assign that 352. We have a set of dog tags. We could assign that 353. But then, and it's not in this image, but imagine you've got 10 postcards. And often postcards are, they do come in groups. So say that you've got 10 postcards, rather than giving those 10 individual tickets, just give it 1. 354 we can assign to the 10 postcards. So once we've assigned all these numbers to the individual objects and items, we can jot all that information down on what we call an object list. And this is an example object list here. So this is another form that you'll have on that interview desk along with the story form. And it's fairly self-explanatory, as you can see. The contributor name and mobile number you will be able to obtain from the other forms they've got, the permission form. The interviewer, I assume, would be you or the volunteer that is interviewing that person. And then you just jot down the object number with the object description. So going by this example, we'd say 351 is the 3 buttons. So when you've finally extracted all of that information, all the information that you can from the person, once you've completed all the details on the story form, you've completed all the details on the object list, you will have a nice collection of forms and items and various other documents. And remember, you'll also have the forms from the welcome stage, the permissions form. So you've got a lot of documents, and we do advise you to have things like staplers and things on the interview desk, because you want to collate and collect all these different forms together, as you can see from the next slide. So we use plastic wallets to consolidate all the materials together. And you can see here, you can see some of the items, you can see the collection of raffle tickets, but there should also be some forms in there as well. So what we do here is we say the interviewers will place all the forms, all the objects, all the raffle tickets in one plastic wallet so that they're ready to be digitized. Now, before we talk about the next stage, we need to think about what kind of volunteers we need on the interview desk. Now, we advise you to think about volunteers that might be good conversationalists, might be good at extracting information, perhaps is a good speedy note taker, or if you want to use laptops rather than having to write it by hand, you might want someone that's a quick typer. So these are the kind of qualities you want to look for in a volunteer for this stage. Now, before moving on to the digitisation stage, I should mention that at some collection days, organisers do invite subject experts along. So during this stage, you're going to be talking about lots of different battles and lots of different events in the war, and you might not be particularly familiar or an expert on the First World War, and that's absolutely fine. So if there's any way you can get your hands on a subject expert, it could be someone from a local First World War history association or just the historical association more generally. You could know a teacher or a lecturer from a local university, someone that would be willing to come down for a couple of hours during your event just to mill about, and if anyone has any questions about an item or a story, they could just maybe provide them with some information. I would say that that's not mandatory and that's not particularly very common, but I'm sure you can gather that would be really useful if you could get your hands on someone like that. So we move on to the next stage, the digitisation stage. So we've got all of our materials, all of our items and forms. Now we have to make sure that we can record all that information so that it's ready to be stored. So the interviewer takes the objects in those plastic wallets over to the digitisation area. It's quite hard saying digitisation over and over and again. So yeah, bear with me if I keep saying it wrong. This image here, you can see, looks quite complex, but it doesn't have to be that complex. This is one of our very large-scale events, and you can see we've got lots of equipment, we've got loads of different bulbs and cameras and things, but people have run events with just one camera, people have used an iPhone as their camera. Don't think you have to run it like this. But above all, the digitisation area is where objects are collected after the interview stage, scanned and photographed, i.e. digitised, and then returned to their owner. Now, there are several steps involved in this process to make sure that we get everything recorded in the correct way. So what we tend to suggest is that we have a kind of coordinator appointed and assigned to this area. And you can see here the lady at the front, that's my colleague Ilva. She's very good at doing this. So she stands here at the head of the digitisation area, where she is fully aware of what's coming in, what's going out, what has been scanned, what has been photographed and what hasn't, what belongs to who, that kind of thing. It's just good to have that one person at this stage almost running the show. So that coordinator, as you can see here at the desk, will receive all the objects in those plastic wallets with all that information in and log the details on a form. And you can see that form here. We call that a check-in, check-out list. And it serves a similar purpose to the welcome desk tracking form, because it's just a way for you or the volunteer at this station to keep track of what's coming in, what's going out, what the ticket numbers are, what time the items were collected by the contributors and that kind of thing. And if you don't want to use this template, that's absolutely fine, but we do advise you to have some kind of form or some kind of system that enables you to see what comes in and when, in what order. And that's really important if it gets very busy, because you obviously don't want to mix up all of the items. So the coordinator will keep all the stories and all the objects and all the forms together in those plastic wallets, and they'll place it in what we call a digitisation queue area. Now this image here looks very convoluted, but trust me, it's not. It's just to give you an idea of the flow of this area. So if you can imagine at the front, you might have a digitisation check-in desk. This is where people will come to say, here's my items, or here's the story that I've just had recorded by the interviewers. They're all ready to be digitised. Here they are. It could also be a station where someone comes along and says, okay, I've got my item, you're supposed to be taking a photograph of it, but it's been 20 minutes, I'm just wondering where it is, that kind of thing. So having that front desk of this area is really important. And again, that coordinator can play that role of managing the whole process. Now, those working on the cameras and the scanners obviously don't want to get involved in those kind of issues. They don't want to be the ones having to converse with the public or having to work out what has been and what hasn't been scanned. They just want to be there taking photographs. And especially if you've got a limited time, they really need to get going on photographing things, especially if it's something like a diary. We do really want you to try and get a photograph of every single page in that diary. So you can imagine, even if it's a tiny little diary, that might take quite a while to digitize. So we want the camera people to really focus on that. So if we follow this process, the coordinator places all the wallets with the objects that they need digitizing on a table or a couple of tables that we might call the digitisation queue area. That means anything on that table needs to be digitized. It hasn't been digitized, but it needs to be digitized. So the person working on the camera station will know if they go over to that table, they can rest assured that nothing has been scanned yet. The camera person will then take that, they'll scan it, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then once they've scanned everything, they've taken photographs of everything, they will pop it back in the wallet, the plastic wallet that it came in with all the other forms, and put it on the digitisation done area, another table where everyone will know that if something's on that table, it has been digitised. It will be ready to go back. So, as I say, the image might look slightly convoluted, but it really isn't. It's just a nice flow and a nice way of managing this process. Once it's on that digitisation done area, the coordinator knows that they can go over there, pick it up, log it on their form to say it's been done, it was done at this time, and they can maybe pop it, if you want, on another desk where people know that, okay, these things are ready to collect. Now, it's really important that you have someone on that front desk or overseeing this process, not only because it helps the flow and it helps things to work properly, but also because these are really valuable items. We don't want to just put items on a table and no one can keep their eye on them, because that's obviously very dangerous. So if you are running the whole event and you're thinking about, okay, we need certain volunteers to go on their lunch now, or we're going to give them a toilet break, make sure you don't give everyone on the digitisation area a toilet break at the same time, because we need to make sure that someone is overseeing and monitoring all the items and objects that are stored there. So I think hopefully that's fairly self-explanatory. Now I'm just going to give you some tips to the photographs section, and it might seem fairly straightforward where you just take photographs of the images, and that's absolutely right. But there are a couple of things we would also suggest that you do here. Now, this is really crucial, this first thing I'm going to tell you. What we suggest you do is when you take photographs, the first photograph you take of an object, like you can see in this photo here, is you make sure you take a photograph with the associated raffle ticket. So if you remember at the interview stage, we assigned a raffle ticket to an item. The first photograph that that camera person takes should be the item with the raffle ticket. Now that's really important because if you imagine a week down the line, you've got thousands of images, you've got hundreds of story forms, assuming your event is going to be that big. So you've got story forms and images on your computer. There is no real way that you know which story goes with which image unless you have access to this raffle ticket. That is really the connecting link between the story and the item. So once you've got all the forms, you can see, okay, Mr. Smith brought along this story, this item, and it says here that his object was number 108. So when you're looking through the images, once you found 108, you think, okay, yes, there we go. And you can link them up together. So it's really important that you do this. We then advise you to take as many images as you can of the item, not just from one angle, but from all different angles. So we advise you to try and capture both the front and back of objects, including postcards. Now, often the postcards, especially the embroidered postcards that were very popular during the First World War, are very pretty. They're very nice. They have nice flowers and things like that on. So most people will take photographs of the front of the postcard. But as you can see in the example at the bottom of this slide, there's actually a lot of information on the back of postcards. Even if there isn't writing, and the writing is often really important, especially if you're a historian, you're really interested in the way in which people told their loved ones about what was going on in the trenches. But even if there's no writing at all, we advise you, we would love you to take photographs of the back of postcards. Now, believe it or not, there probably are historians out there that are historians of postcards about things like the manufacture of postcards. So that back of a postcard that gives you information about who published the postcard, who designed it, when it was printed, that kind of thing. To someone out there, that is really good, vital information. So try and get as many angles on these objects as you can. And obviously, as you can see at the top here, this shell, looking at the bottom, it tells you a little bit more information about where it was made, when it was made, that kind of thing. We'd also advise you to try and reduce the blank space around the objects. Now, if you take a photograph quite far away from the object, there might be a lot of blank space around, for example, the medal. Now, when you come to editing the photos and uploading them, that might mean that you want to crop the image. Now, to save yourself time and save yourself having to crop the images, use the zoom on the camera, or actually just move the camera closer. So there's just some little hints, I suppose, that might seem fairly trivial, but actually you'll probably come to realize when you come to uploading it, you'll be really glad that you did these kind of things. We also advise you to be flexible. So if you have set a camera up with a tripod, don't be afraid to take it off the tripod. As you can see in the bottom right here, we've got a man laying down for whatever reason. So don't be afraid to be flexible. And there are going to be some items, as you can see in the bottom left, that are far too large to take a photo of in a very professional way. So don't worry about having people's hands in the photo or having people in the photo as well. We're not too pernickety about that kind of thing. We have a question here. Any standard protocol for the number of pictures to be taken item, naming the digital file, etc.? No, we don't have a standard protocol for the number of pictures to be taken per item. Obviously, as long as you get a good range of photographs from different angles, from the top, the bottom, the sides, make sure they're quite good quality. It might be worth taking a few images just to make sure you get a good quality. In terms of the naming of the digital files, we don't really advise you to have to go through all of them, because you'll realize you do take hundreds, if not thousands of images. So don't worry too much about the naming. It might be a good idea, though, of naming your memory cards. So if, for example, you had 4 cameras, on the go at the same time. If you're running a large event, you could say that is camera 1. So the memory card in there is camera 1. The memory card in the next one is camera 2. So when it comes to uploading stories and items later on, you know exactly which story relates to which camera. And I'm going to show you on the next slide why we do that. So once the camera person has taken all of the images that they want, then they have to fill in this object list form. So they're completing the object list form that the interviewers started. And you can see here, digitizer, if you look at that column, JB would be someone's initials, but maybe they've said cam1. So like I just said, they'll say, right, this item, the image for this item is on camera 1, and the person that took that photograph was JB. And that's really useful if further down your line you think, okay, there's a bit of a problem with this image, or I'm not really sure which image which story this image relates to. But at least with this information, you know, okay, well, who was manning camera 1? It was JB. Let's get in contact with JB and see if he can remember. So it's just some more information that could help you in the long run. And we do also suggest you jot down the time as well. You can see here in the From Digitisation column, the time in which those photographs were taken. Again, because if you have thousands of items and you're not really sure, if there's no standardized naming convention for the files, it's good to know, okay, it was taken at around 10 past 10, so the story form, that person was interviewed at around 10 past 10, so maybe it goes with that person. It's just a really useful way when it comes to uploading. And again, you probably won't have to worry about this kind of thing, but it's always best to put down as much information as you can. So as I say, this form, the camera person will fill it in. They'll talk about which camera, they'll talk about which memory card, they'll write down the initials of the person who scanned it and photographed it. Now, once they've taken all of the images and they've filled in all of the documents, they can pop it all back in the wallet in which it arrived at the desk, and they can pop it on the digitisation done area. So the coordinator at the front knows, okay, everything here has been done. It's ready to go back to the person that brought it along. So what they do is they log it on their tracking form to say it was done at this time, it's ready to go. And then the visitors will come along with their raffle tickets and say, hi, I'm here, I've got number 354, I'm waiting for it to be picked up. And it's there ready waiting, and you make the exchange. You take the raffle ticket and they take their items. Now, what we do there, just before we do hand it back to them, there is on one of the forms, the object list, I believe at the bottom, where the person can sign it. So what they're signing is to say, we have received everything we handed in. So we do advise them, if, for example, there's a box of items they brought along, we don't just hand it back and say goodbye. We say, look, can you just look through this box and make sure everything that you brought along is in here? And if it is, just sign this to say that you're happy. So that's something we do there to cover our back. So that's really the digitisation stage. As I said, it's fairly straightforward. Throw down as much information as you can onto these forms so that when you come to upload it later, it's much easier for you, especially if you do it a week or two after. You might have forgotten things, so it's good to have that information written down. Now, the upload stage, I'm not going to talk about the upload stage too much because, firstly, it's fairly self-explanatory and straightforward, and also because it's something you'll do after the collection day. But basically what you're doing here is uploading everything that you've obtained, uploading the story, uploading the item, the images of the items, uploading all of the information you've collected onto today onto our online archive. So what you need to do is, even though running your event is a major achievement, you need to be aware that there's still some work to do after the event. So you need to make sure you have maybe enough volunteers, you have internet connection, you have computers, you have the memory cards safely stored somewhere. You need to plan for that post-event period. Now, once the stories and images are in a suitable condition, i.e. you've got rid of any blurred photos, you've cropped them, things like that, you can upload them to our online archive, which you can see, you can access by this link. Now, on our website, you can find the link. You'll find the link on the training forms that I sent you. And as I said, I didn't really want to go into too much detail about this because the upload form that you'll find on our website is a basic replica of that story form. It has the same headings. It asks you to fill in information about the name of the person, the dates, the places, the story, the items, and things like that. So it's really a self-explanatory form. So what you're doing here, uploading information about the story, the objects, the images, and then you're clicking OK. What happens then is it comes to us. Now, it doesn't go live on the database immediately. It comes to us. We'll check it and check that it makes sense. And we're obviously assuming everything you guys write will make sense, but we do have children involved in schools, and sometimes their fashion there might be slightly odd. So we do make sure and check for spellings there, and then we upload it onto our site. Now, before I move on to talk about how we can make your collection day a success, I should just give you a couple of tips. Firstly, it's likely that the stories written on the story forms will require editing before being uploaded. Now, often if people are writing very quickly, they're trying to take down information, they're going to write things like abbreviations, they're going to write in shorthand. So ideally, we do say the people that upload the forms should be those that interview the people. But again, if they can't commit to volunteering for that length of time, then don't worry too much. Also, before you upload these forms, going to have to browse through all the images of objects and ensure they're in a suitable condition. You want to make sure they're not too pixelated, so get rid of any images that aren't so good, and use the best resolution photos. You want to cut out any unnecessary blank space. As best as you can, you want to cut out people's fingers or thumbs if they are in, but don't worry, we understand if that was necessary. And also, this is really important, and you'd be surprised at the amount of people that do this. You want to make sure that they're facing the correct way, that the correct way up, that you've rotated the image. You don't want to upload a photograph that's upside down. And I don't like having to tell you that, but we have had some images where they've been uploaded upside down. And something else to remember is if you do upload something incorrectly, if you have attached the wrong image to the wrong story, don't worry, we can edit it. You can just send us an email and we can tidy that up. So don't feel like you have one shot at this, you have one chance. Everything on our site can be edited, moved around, deleted, anything. It also might be worth bearing in mind that you might have to deal with some inquiries after the event. Some people that have brought along items might want to find out what's happened to them, if they're uploaded yet, whether there'll be other events in the area, that kind of thing. Now, often people will come directly to us. We do give them that information, but often they'll come to you. So you might need to think about resourcing for that as well. So now I just want to talk and give you some tips about how we can make your collection day a success. So you hopefully by now have got some grasp of the process involved, but we're now going to give you some tips really as to how you can really make sure that the collection day goes as you plan. So something to think about that's really important is the venue. Now this is really important. Now, and there are several things you need to consider when you're deciding where to actually hold your event. Firstly, is it easily accessible? Is it in a convenient location? Now, members of the public are more likely to attend your event if it's easy for them to get to the venue. So try to find somewhere that's in a fairly central location, maybe with parking facilities, with good public transport links, and perhaps somewhere that's accessible, well, it has to be accessible by people with reduced mobility. Now, you have to remember that a lot of the people that will come along to these events and a lot of the people that have these items are more likely to have reduced mobility than others that wouldn't. So you do need to factor that into your decision. You'll also have to think about whether and how close your venue is to other facilities. Ideally, we'd advise you to find a venue that's near other facilities that people are likely to visit, particularly during the daytime, such as maybe a high street or a coffee shop. Often people, if they bring along their items and there's a bit of a queue, they like to go away and do something else. They don't just like to sit around for half an hour waiting. Sometimes they like to go and get a coffee or do their shopping. We've had a question from Brian. Scanners pixel size 400 ppi for clarity. Yeah, absolutely. We haven't used scanners for a long time, mainly because a lot of volunteers don't have scanners. But if you have a scanner, that's great. But yes, 400 ppi is really good for clarity. That's fine. So yeah, is it close to other facilities? Another way of attracting participants to an event is to hold the event in a venue that is normally closed to the public. So if you can get your hands on access to a museum of some kind, there might be a room or a collection at a museum that is normally closed off. If you can run your event alongside something like that, then that's another way of attracting people along. Also, is your venue big enough? There should be enough space for the three main areas or stations, i.e. the welcome, the interview, and the digitisation station. But you also need to make sure there's room for staff and visitors and equipment. You should make sure there's room for people to actually wait as well, or maybe for an area for them to see or to look at whilst they're waiting. Now, you'll probably notice I'm being fairly vague because there isn't really a perfect size room for this kind of thing. We've run it in very small rooms in the library. We've also run it in very large town halls and universities and things. So there isn't a perfect size, but you do need to make sure that if you anticipate 100 people coming, you need a room that has room for 100 people. Alternatively, very recently we went to a collection day that was very small. It was in a very small little village, and the organizer knew that the only people that would come along were people that lived in that village, i.e. I think there must have been about 30 people in that whole village. So he did not have to prepare for something very large, and that's fine. It was in a very small little village hall, and it worked really well. So don't worry too much about it having to be huge. Just accommodate, just enough to accommodate the people you expect to come along. Also, you need to think about whether you're able to access the venue before the event. This is really important if you want to get in early to set up equipment, and maybe if you're super duper excellent planner, you might want to test run the process with your volunteers. Also, is it technology friendly? Now, you don't have to have an internet connection because, especially if you're not uploading anything on the day to our archive, you don't necessarily need internet connection. But it's quite important that you have access to electricity. So you have power sockets and things like that, especially if you're charging cameras or you're using scanners or you have light bulbs for your camera equipment, that kind of thing. Now, also remember that if you're hiring a venue, you might need that venue to perform a safety check on your electrical equipment. So that's something you're going to have to liaise with the owners of the venue, if you are hiring, of course. And also, you need to think about how cheap it is to hire. You could try and reduce the cost of hire, for example, by offering to promote the event, promote the venue, or by coordinating a collection day with another event that they've got going on. So if you're putting the logo of the venue or the library on your promotional materials, you could try and negotiate a cheaper cost. Now, I should say here, and I'm not entirely sure how much, but the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation, who we work in partnership with, do say that I think there's a pot of money. I think there's around £150 per event that you can access if you want, and it can be used for pretty much anything. So it could be used towards the cost of venue hire. It could be used towards the cost of equipment. So don't feel like you're completely on your own. If you're really interested in obtaining around £150 to help you running this event, then do get in contact with us when it comes to planning it. Other things to think about then with regards to the venue, you need to make sure that venue staff are there on the day. Is there someone there that can actually let you into the building, or will you have the keys? What about the arrangements for car parking on the day? If a library, for example, has a car park, will there be free parking for the contributors, or will they have to pay? Think about access to refreshments. There might be vending machines. You need to make sure they're on, or there might be tea and coffee making facilities. Also, as I mentioned, safety regulations. Find out if there is a limit on the amount of people that you can have in a particular room. Is there first aid equipment on the premises? What happens if a fuse blows? Where are the mops? These kind of things might seem quite silly at this stage, but actually they're really important. And you don't have to have a backup plan for everything, but it's good to know who you can call, for example, if you don't know something about the venue. Now, something else you have to think about, obviously, is the date and the time of your event. You want to attract as many people as you can to your event. So you need to think about when people are most likely to be able to attend and some of the obstacles that may prevent them from attending on certain dates at certain times. So some timing considerations might include school and public holidays. things like half terms. Will that mean that more people can come, or actually will it mean that, for example, parents are going to be busier? They might be off work to look after their children, that kind of things. Bank holidays as well, you think that's good because people might not be in work, but alternatively they might not want to come along to something, especially if it's August bank holiday and it's nice weather. So you need to think about that, and also the time of the year. It's also worth thinking about the working week. When do people take their lunch hours from work? What about weekends? When's rush hour? What about the cost and availability of public transport? If people need to use the bus to get somewhere, they might want to come at a time when the bus is cheaper. Same with parking as well. And you might want to hold your event after building up momentum for public interest in a particular subject. So we had a lot of these collection days around November last year, when it was the 100th anniversary of the end of the conflict. So that did generate a lot of interest. People, because the First World War was on the news and in the public domain a lot more, there was definitely more demand at that time. But you can equally do something like this now. In the middle of this year, it's going to be the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Versailles, which was the official end of the conflict. So if you wanted to link it to that, that's another good way of generating interest. You also need to think about promotion. How are you going to actually promote it? And we found that this is one of the most important factors in whether your collection day is a success or not. It's great if you've got a great venue and great volunteers, but if people don't even know it's happening, then it's very unlikely that you're going to get as many people as you want. So when you're promoting your event, you need to think about who your audience is, and what is the most useful method of connecting with that particular audience. And there are lots of different ways you can do this. So if you distribute posters and leaflets and flyers, where do you want to do that? We'd recommend you distributing them in museums, in libraries, in cafes, in coffee shops, newsagents, community centres. Now, social media platforms, of course, are very useful and quite an easy way of promoting events. Things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, of course. But you need to also think about who are the kind of people that use these. And we do find that this is a good way of drumming up interest among schools, universities, researchers, students, community groups. But it's not necessarily the perfect target audience for attracting people that have First World War memorabilia. So do also think about sending emails to libraries, community groups, maybe old people's homes, charities, that kind of things. And actually, when we do a very quick feedback review with people, particularly people of the older generation, we say to them, how did you hear about the event? You'll find that actually a lot of them read about it in their local newspaper, their local maybe newsletter, that kind of thing. So local newspapers might seem like a very old-fashioned way of promoting this kind of thing, but for the target audience, it's really, really useful. So do get in touch with your local newspaper, with local radio stations, even the local television station, to see if they'd be interested not only in promoting your event, but actually sending someone down and covering it and interviewing. And actually, we found that a lot of them do. Most of the events we've gone to, we've had some form of representative from the media come along and take a couple of photos. So we'd really advise you to do that. And it doesn't take much. It could just be a quick email to the relevant newspaper. You need to think about your volunteers. How many volunteers do you need? This is a question we get a lot. How many volunteers do we need to run a digital collection day? There isn't really an easy answer to this because, again, it depends on how big you want your event to be. If you're running it in central London on a Saturday afternoon in, I don't know, the Royal Albert Hall, for example, you're going to need a lot of volunteers. Now, that's an extreme case. We're not advising you to do that, of course. But if you're running it in a tiny village hall, you know that there's lots of people in that village that have items. You've already talked about it with them. You don't need a great deal of volunteers. So we'd probably say between 5 and 10, maybe for a small to medium-sized event. And then as it gets larger, you need more and more volunteers. But most of the events that we've seen are between 5 and 10. The one I went to recently in a very small village, we had 3, 4 volunteers. But that, I'd say that's an extreme case as well. That's very, very small. You need to think about what kind of volunteers you need and who is going to do what. So you're going to need volunteers that interact with the public, that can record and digitize stories, that can take photographs, and also after the event, people that are going to upload these stories and items to the database. Now, we do advise you to have a kind of floor manager, and that could be you. If you're the one that is organising the event, you're going to be the person that has all the knowledge of this kind of thing. So you might want to take that role. But it's really important to have a kind of go-to person for any queries, because a lot of people won't have had this kind of training. They'll just turn up and say, I want to get involved, but they'll need someone that they can go to ask, what form do I use here? What happens if someone says they don't want this part of the story to go online? That kind of thing. It's good to have a go-to person for that kind of query. Also, as you can see from these images on the slide, that go-to person could almost run a briefing session right at the beginning or just before the day starts, and that's really good as well, just to say, look, this is the welcome desk, this is what's going to happen here, this is the interview area, and so on and so forth. And also you need to think about where you're going to place volunteers. You don't want to put someone on the welcome desk who doesn't like interacting with the public, or who actually can come across as quite rude to the public. You also, on the other hand, don't want someone who's very unfamiliar with cameras working in the digitisation area. So do play to people's strengths and actually just ask people, where would you like to go? Where do you think that you'd contribute most? And then we move on to equipment. Now you're obviously going to need to print out all of the forms that I've been talking about today, and I've sent you the training pack, and I'll send it to you again. So all the forms are in that pack. So you're going to have to print out versions and various copies of those forms. Now, additional equipment that you need, as well as those forms, really depends on how you intend to run the event. So if you prefer to record visitors' stories on paper and you're very happy with that, you're going to obviously need lots of things like pens and paper and things like that. But if you prefer to record it all electronically and you're very tech savvy, you're going to need laptops, you're going to need chargers, you might need a reliable internet connection, depending on how you want to back up these stories. But I'll give you a very broad list of some of the equipment that people who've also organised collection days in the past have used. So, for example, people have used a computer or computers to access online resources. Often people will come along and they don't know much about where, for example, their ancestor was buried. So you could just have a laptop on the go with access to the Commonwealth War Graves site, which I know you can use to find out that information. But again, that is really not mandatory. You're going to need lots of stationery, pens, paper, staplers, and the good old raffle tickets. They'll come in very handy. You also need to think about tables and chairs. Will there be enough chairs for people to sit down if they're waiting? You might want a projector if you want to display a slideshow or a film or something like that if people are waiting there. Even things like First World War related books for reference purposes. You can get really good reference books about uniforms and medals and things like that. So if somebody does bring along something that's fairly unusual, a button or a badge of some kind, it's quite good to have that reference book there just to help you and help them understand where this has come from. There's obviously a lot of equipment that's going to come with the digitisation station, things like cameras. But also, if you want, you can bring along scanners. You also will need things like memory cards, spare batteries, battery chargers. If you're going to use some lighting equipment, you might need a spare light bulb. If you want to use tripods, you're going to need those. As you can see here on the left, we have a copy stand. This is the kind of equipment we have, but don't worry if you don't have these. It's very rare for people to have all of this equipment because it's not something people normally have. But we just thought we'd mention it in case you are thinking about going quite far with the camera equipment. You also need a backup solution for captured images. It might be worth bringing along an external hard drive, or if you do have internet connection and a laptop, thinking about having a Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive account where you can store your photographs electronically. So how do we measure whether we've had a successful day or not? Well, it's very hard to quantify this kind of thing. We don't say it's based on the number of people that you have. Some of the best collection days we've had have only had about 8 to 12 people come along. But that's because people have brought along very unusual items. They've brought along very personal and, as I say, unusual stories. Sometimes 1 or 2 people will bring along about 30, 40 items. So it doesn't matter how many people you get along. One of the main ways of measuring it might sound quite corny, but it's actually whether visitors are happy with the experience. Did they feel that it was worth coming along? Did they seem happy? And in the main, people are really happy. They feel like this medal that they've had in their attic for 30, 40, 50 years that was passed down to them from a family member is finally going somewhere that is going to be stored and preserved for future generations. So actually they go along feeling they've made a really strong contribution, and that's because they have. And we make sure that they go away feeling that as well. And we do have some thank you cards, and if you want these thank you cards that we hand out, just let us know and we can send you a few copies. As I put here, I put quality contributions. It's not the number of contributions. Quality contributions is really good. Do you have any meaningful stories, really good, unusual objects? That's always a good way of measuring it as well. And also, it's really important that you enjoyed yourself, and you'll realize that this all might sound quite like it's a lot of work and there's a lot of planning, but you'll realize it's all worth it. And it's not really that much planning. It's we just try to cover all the bases. But actually, you'll realize on the day that it was really worthwhile, and you'll feel like you've made a really strong contribution to preserving all of this for future generations. But there are some slightly more formal ways of measuring the success of a collection day. And again, in that training pack, you'll find some visitor feedback forms. So if you want, you can hand these out to people as they're waiting, and they can just circle some options, some questions. Do you feel like today was of value? What did you enjoy most? This kind of thing. It's a good way of measuring how much people enjoyed it and how much value they feel like they've contributed to the project. And also, you might want to jot down the number of people that come and even the demographics. And this is something that our funders, the Heritage Lottery Fund, are really key. We're not entirely comfortable with the idea of you having to ask people what age they are or their ethnicity, that kind of thing. We're not really keen on that, but if you do that, that would be great for our funders. It's also important that you try and make the most of your collection day. So once the collection day is over, that's brilliant, but you might then want to start promoting it and say, look, we came across this. And once the items and the stories are on our website, you can use that in your various campaigns. If you work for a library, for example, you can claim that as your own. Don't feel like once you've handed this over to us, this is ours and you therefore have nothing to do with it. You can continue to work with us and you can promote all this stuff, especially if there's a lot of information that's come in that helps, that could potentially teach people about your local area. So feel free to promote that by exhibiting that collected material. You might want to work with your local schools perhaps to utilize those materials in some form. And also, if something really interesting or unusual's come in, feel free to share that story with the media after the event. Don't feel like that's the end when the event's over. Now, that's pretty much covered the whole thing. I did try and rush through it as best as I could. I'm sorry if you all need the toilet. We normally have a toilet break, but I thought as it's late, we want to rush through it. Do you have any other questions at all? Because as I say, that's pretty much the whole of our training session done. If you have any questions, fire them over in the group chat. If you don't have any more questions, then I can just say thank you very, very much for expressing an interest. This is an entirely volunteer-run project. It doesn't work if we don't have volunteers and people going away and running these events. We just sit in Oxford, just sat there looking at the computer screen with nothing happening. So it's all down to you, and we're just really grateful that you've done this. But if you do have any questions that you can't think of now, but once you look through the training materials, you do feel like, okay, I want to ask that, you can just email us at that address there, www.collections@itoxacuk. And again, you will have my email address anyway from the emails I sent you, but feel free to fire over any emails you have. And that, as I say, is not the end. If you are planning on an event, we will guide you through that process. Pick up the phone, send us an email, we can help you. And if you really want us to come along, we can probably send someone along to help. So yeah, that's pretty much it from me. We have just had a question from Katie. Are there any suggestions for when they should take place? Well, our project ends in June. Now, by that, we don't necessarily mean it has to be done by June. If you organise an event for after June, you can do it. You can use all of our equipment and all our training materials. You can upload it to our archive. The problem is there might not be anyone at the other end of the line that can give you advice. So my contract at Oxford, for example, will run out on this project, will run out in June. So I won't be there to respond to you. So that's what we mean when the project ends. But if you don't feel like you can arrange an event before June, don't worry, run it in July, August or September. You can add it to our archive and it will be stored digitally. Everything will happen. You just won't be able to pick up the phone to anyone and get advice. So if you can do it before June, that would probably work best for you, just because you do have that support from us. But don't worry too much if not. We do have a couple of other questions. Callum, what would happen if someone brought in an item that obtained illegally, specifically through metal detecting in France or Belgium? Would the response be similar to weapons? Well, yes, if they're going to admit that that's how they obtained it, I assume yes. We've never had that before. That's a very good question. But yeah, we probably would advise you to try and get as far away as you can so you're not involved in any way. We would say, unfortunately, as it was obtained illegally, we can't, by law, be a party to that. And you have to do that in a polite way if you can. Brian, risk assessments in village halls, etc. have for the most been done already. You only need to see and sign that you have seen and risk assessment has been done. Just do a quick look to see if risk is, yes, that's a very good point. So we do have a sample risk assessment form, again, in that training pack that you might want to complete. But if you are hiring a venue, do be mindful that things like insurance and all of that often have been completed already. Things like risk assessments have been completed by the venue themselves, but it's worth checking whether that has been done or not. It's slightly different if you're the manager of a certain venue and that's the venue you're using, but just use your initiative and common sense, I suppose, on that kind of thing. Hannah says, thank you. No, thank you, Hannah. Grace K, can this lecture be found online? Yes, I remembered to click record this time, which I didn't do the first time. So yes, this will be uploaded onto our website, where you can watch and listen to my voice all over again. Brian, cheers, thank you. Melanie, you mentioned earlier that you go into an international archive. Do you know any points of contact for similar volunteer opportunities in other countries? Germany, for example. Yes, I do. The project that we are sort of a small part of is called the Europeana project, and that's a European-wide digitisation initiative, which doesn't just focus on the First World War, but it focuses on digitally recording various different historical events. So I will, when I send out my post-training email, I'll include the link to that website, and they're the people you can really get in contact with for this kind of initiative. And they do things in Germany and France and various other European countries. I think that's all the questions. Last one, Brian. One part of my area already done in the book, The Lost Men of Shotley. Is this already with you? No, we've not had that. No, we've not had that. So if you want to email us with information about that, then that would be really useful. Everyone's saying thanks, so I think I'll wrap up now. But thank you all for coming along. As I say, if you have any questions, just email them. But in the meantime, yeah, I'm sure I'll speak to you again soon. Cheers then.